Jump scares. We've seen them all. Some of us may be victims, other of us sometimes the scarer. From the quick and loud to the slow and spine-tingling, jump scares cement their legacy throughout all types of media, and it's time we take a serious look into the history of this technique and what exactly made it so infamous in the first place. The history of the jump scare is one I personally find super interesting to look into. There is almost an air of disrespect and annoyance that comes from this technique seen throughout 50 years plus of horror, and understandably so.
Yeah, whatever.
Horror movies, especially modern horror movies, rely too often on this cheap trick, so much so that it's forever damaged the image and the tension that's made from many modern horrors. Though that's not the rule, there's unfortunately just a few bad eggs out there that unfortunately also seem to make up a lot of modern cinema goer audiences. And of course, it's not only film and TV shows that use this technique, but also gaming, which is the part I really want to look at with the critical lens. But first we need to travel back in time and see where this modern menace comes from. There are four main figures that we can point our finger towards in history to see where the jump scare started. 1925's Phantom of the Opera, 1941's Citizen Kane, and 1942 The Cat People. But in regards to the modern standard of horror and what we expect in modern cinema, 1976 Carrie. Many of these were seen as key milestones that got us to where we are now, but the jump scare is only relevant to the conditioning of the audiences at the time. What was once scary and unseen in 1925 is something we may see now every day and unfaze us, so don't expect to be jumping out of your seats anytime soon. 1925's Phantom of the Opera is known as one of the scariest movies ever seen because of the practical effects used on the Phantom's face. The scene that is most famous and the one that I will be referring to as the use of a jump scare is of course the scene where Christine unmasks the Phantom while he's playing her the piano. What works so well about this scene and even now is how the camera suddenly jumps to Phantom looking dead straight at the audience, and the camera itself holds long enough for you to be able to read Christine's reactions, but also for the audience to be able to get a good look at the Phantom's horrifying face for the time. This is practically 100 years ago and I still think it holds up pretty well, and the imagery is straight up iconic. It was said one time that this had people screaming, fainting and running out of the theatres where they first saw it back in 25. It's kind of crazy now and damn right respectful just how iconic of a horror moment this is in cinema. Silent movie or not, it definitely stands out for sure. Taking a bit of a leap now 20 years to 1941 with maybe one of the most well-known and important movies to ever come out in cinema, Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane isn't a horror movie and yet it's known for having the first jump scare, or is it? This is pretty contested whether it's accidental or if it is meant to be scary. The reason people contest whether this counts as a jump scare is because it wasn't too scare, it was too awake. Two characters are talking about past events, and as the film transitioned to the altercation they're referring to, there wasn't just a clean fade, but instead a cockatoo screeching full blown at the audience.
Time his wife left him.
The audio is loud, it's disjointed compared to the rest of the tone of the film, and you can see how this must have terrified people with how sudden it is. It wasn't made for scaring, but instead to make sure the audience was paying attention to the scene, to make sure they're still awake in this pretty lengthy movie at the time. Possibly maybe one of the most important jump scares to ever hit the screens is in 1942, with a technique famously known now as the Lewton Bus. And believe it or not, it's one we and even you are all familiar with. In the scene I'm referring to, we find our character Alice walking alone on a dark street. There is no music and the only thing we can hear is the sound of her heels hitting the concrete pavement, but she gets this aching feeling that she's beginning to be stalked by what is possibly a cat person. The scene plays out like we've seen in many horrors. She continues to walk alone, paranoid, constantly looking behind herself to check if anything is there, and of course nothing is, but her paranoia gets the better of her and she begins to start running while still checking. The scene plays out long enough for nothing to happen, and just as she's about to check one last time, we hear what sounds like a possible growl, and then a bus comes out of nowhere and of course makes everyone shit their pants. This is why it's called the Lewton Bus technique, referring to the producer Val Lewton, who was once synonymous with this technique being used in many films he also produced. A nice little touch with this, and coming from the cat people, is this technique is often used when referring to people using cats in jump scares. You've all seen them: Alien, Silent Hill 1, Scary Movie.
Kitty, you scared me.
If there isn't a clear case of what's the most influential jump scare of all time, I say just look at all the homage of jump scare and how many scary cats it spawned in its wake. But the cat people isn't the most influential jump scare of all time. That has to go to 1976's Carrie. Carrie helped carry the template for horror that we all know now. Near the end of the movie, the character Sue goes to visit a lot where Carrie's house once stood. She's visiting this for sale sign, which is almost like a grave for Carrie herself. With her laying the events of the movie to rest, all of it seems hopeful. It all seems like it's done and dusted, until hands come out of the ground, grab the character, and she wakes up screaming, having you wonder whether the telepathic powers of Carrie still exist, and is she still out there alive? This is a trope that shaped and still shapes horror that we know now as a staging device to set up sequels. It could have been Friday the 13th, we've seen it in Nightmare on Elm Street, The Ring, and nearly every horror movie that you've ever seen past the 80s. We've seen the fake ending that was taken from Carrie used over and over again, and it doesn't stop at films but also in video games too. There is a long history that dates back 100 years, and it goes even deeper than these examples that I gave. There are so many important jump scares that even stand out to this day that didn't invent the technique. David Lynch's Mulholland Drive jump scare came out in 2001 and still sticks with people. Even 1959's Haunting on Hill House with the creepy old lady in the candle scene to this day is still so effective with how subtle and eerie and sudden it is. But that's not what I want to talk about. Video games and interactive media, despite being a totally different medium to play with, are able to use the technique of jump scares and even change how they're being delivered to the audience. Whether it's an unsuspecting viral webcomic like the Bonchon Dong Ghost, tricking people to play the classic maze game, or the pick of several exorcist screamers we saw in the early phase of the internet days. How people these days will never understand what we went through. Jump scaring in gaming and internet culture has a rich history that still haunts us and has unfortunately trained us to roll our eyes one too many times.
Son of a bitch.
Here's a question: what is the first jump scare in gaming? 1996's Resident Evil 1 is known and constantly mistakenly cited as the first jump scare in gaming, with the iconic dog jumping through the window scare. Walking through one of the main lower corridors, you are met with this dog that comes breaking through this window, forcing the player into an often unpredictable fight, which the game was known for at the time. You can see why this jump scare is iconic and maybe stuck out to so many because it was so effective at the time. Resident Evil 2 has two window scenes, with a licker and the other one with the zombie's arms. Resident Evil 3 has the Nemesis jumping through the RPD. Code Veronica has the Bandersnatch, of course, breaking through the office window. And even as late as Resident Evil 7, we have this ugly thing smashing through the window as well. Hell, even for fun, Capcom threw one into Dino Crisis, which obviously needed a piece of that jump scary window action. Even just a year prior, in 1995, there was Clock Tower 1, developed by Human Interactive, using that fundamental groundwork designed from the slasher genre during the 80s and applied it to a video game to create pretty effective jump scares. With the Scissor Man hiding and striking in the most unexpected places, with his haunting cutting theme, sorry about the pun, piercing through the player's ears. But even then, we can go back further. How about 1985 with the Lucasfilm produced Rescue on Fractalus? A pretty genius tension building space game that can still have its influences felt in the likes of Five Nights at Freddy's. In Rescue on Fractalus, Fractalus. You are able to fly around a hostile planet, saving other humans from invading alien spaceships, which you have to destroy. The tension comes from landing on the planet after destroying the UFOs and having to wait for each pilot to run to your ship, knock on the door and allow you to let them in. You see where that influence of Five Nights at Freddy's comes in. You're just doing a job, sitting down, saving dudes. Every now and then something incredible will happen. You will see the very same person running towards the ship, expecting the same knock from every human to save his life. This thing decides to then jump on your window screen and start smashing in the window. It's absolutely terrifying, it's incredible, it's so iconic for 1985. I'm not sure why Resident Evil is cited as the first jump scare when this is way more compelling of an argument for the first jump scare in video games. In 1985, Rescue on Fractalus. I don't care. It's clear that horror was changing with the times. Much like Phantom of the Opera to Carrie, Rescue on Fractalus to any Resident Evil in the trilogy, horror has to evolve with the pace and with the times of the audience to continue to be effective. Many may know the early screamer of the ghost in the car. This was a German energy drink called F.E.A.R, but this advert was so scary and effective that it literally stained the minds of a whole generation, despite only being a TV ad for an energy drink. This advert proved the jump scare was more than just a tool to use in horror, but was a tool for the masses, and that had become very apparent in the early 2000s for sure. Audiences will change over the decades, and horror's age gap also changes too. Commonly associated with the adult target audience, the jump scare can now be seen in any group form. From Courage the Cowardly Dog to Mario 64's Piano, Halo 1's Elite, or even the Bioshock Dentist, there is a huge range here which all share one thing: the jump scare. And as we moved through the 2000s into the 2010s, games were becoming faster than ever before. No longer was we keeping players stuck in rooms or needed a contextual scene on the screen to be scary or to activate the said jump scares. Now, scares had been able to become way more organic in the world and the play spaces given to the players. For me personally, I don't think any jump scare in a video game has beaten F.E.A.R 1. A game literally full to the brim of silent, subtle jump scare and uneasy moments which can be easily missed throughout its runtime, but there's one that you can't avoid: the ladder jump scare. The player is forced to go down a ladder to proceed throughout the level, but as the player turns around to descend, you see Alma slowly walking towards you, sending an instant shiver down your spine as you proceed to quickly climb down this ladder. Just as you're getting over the shock of that, you turn around and then you also see your brother walking towards you as well, who also disappears in an instant. It's a double bill of fantastic jump scares that I've never forgotten, and anytime I played any F.E.A.R game after it, I was eager to see if it would ever be returned or even beat. The pacing of a jump scare can be important. I found it quite shocking the reaction people got from Alan Wake 2 constantly using jump scares, but there's a contextual reason to why it's as aggressive as it is. But in later updates, they also added an update for you to be able to change the pacing of their jump scares, so it's hard to defend the artistic vision behind the jump scares of Alan Wake 2. And jump scares don't always need to be fast paced, with say the likes of Eternal Darkness's incredible bathtub scene, violently making the player aware of their situation, throwing them right in front of a bathtub, seeing your character dead and screaming. It's intense, it's quick, and it doesn't always need to be like this, with great examples like PT. PT, as I've spoken about it before, is as subtle as horror gets. Sure, it has its moments and has its loud jump scares. The way that Lisa slowly walks and droops to the side as she cries and then quickly runs at you is an exact mimicry of the scene we saw in the Mama short film, and it's just, it's beautiful. It's one of those jump scares that you feel scared before you even realize that it's too late. The slow jump scare can be so effective. Think of any ghost encounter from Fatal Frame, as ghosts slowly appear in front of the player's vision. They don't need to come running at the camera, but just a small glimpse of the enemy is enough to send shivers down your spine, or even the reveal of High Lord Wolnir in Dark Souls. It's slow, it's impactful, it's the exact pacing that people appreciate from a good jump scare. You don't always just need a Silent Hill Pop-Tart. Yep, that's a real jump scare in a movie. Jump scares are often used as a way to symbolize a turning point in movies and shows, but throughout gaming we haven't had to depend on that being as much of the case, though it's still very much there. But the indie scene of the 2010s got hold of this technique and used it to their best abilities to pander to the internet, with the likes of Slender and Five Nights at Freddy's using the jump scares as not just a part of the game, but as the sole identity. Thanks to the YouTube likes of PewDiePie, Markiplier and Jacksepticeye, audiences were now experiencing some of gaming's more obscure titles and the indie scene throughout watching them being played by dedicated horror let's play channels. Cry of Fear, Amnesia, RPG Maker, Five Nights at Freddy's, any Slender clone, there are so many. Jump scare gaming on its own became its own genre and became a brand new way to entertain people on the internet, something harkening back to the pranking days of the Screamer era of the early 2000s. But now, instead of us having to trick people into playing these games, we had people willing to play these scary games and allow us to be scared alongside with them, and gaming of course adapted to this as well. Slender the 8 Pages was at one point the biggest game in the world, spawning an unseeable amount of clones and sequels and full remakes. But why did this work? Slender needed the player to be able to push themselves to be willing to be scared. The more pages you collect, the more tense the game becomes, the bigger the chance you have of being scared and being killed to start over, with each appearance of the Slender Man always ending usually with someone going. This was a win-win for the viewer and for the creator. The viewer can guarantee a jump scare and a reaction they would never forget, and the creator gets tons of views and continues to play the game. This was jump scare culture of the 2010s, and I was in deep with that bunch because who doesn't love watching people get scared? The atmosphere with horror gaming changed with Five Nights at Freddy's, PT, and even Resident Evil 7 The Beginning Hour. Now it wasn't just about the jump scares, it was about the intrigue behind them and the narrative of these games being fed to both the player and the audience viewing the person playing. Five Nights at Freddy's was a game that did exactly the same thing as Slender did prior, pushing the player as time went on, the scares got worse, but asked the player to continue playing, to continue seeing this story through, to see if they can last until 6 AM. It was one of the biggest horror sensations I had ever seen in gaming at that time. It's crazy to me now that Markiplier's first FNAF playthrough is now a decade old, yet it only seems like yesterday I was sitting alone on my laptop, wanting to understand both this game but also see Markiplier shit his pants. Jump scares had to change once again with the times, and Five Nights at Freddy's and Slender taught us that players are willing to endure horror in a totally new landscape, with the likes of Phasmophobia and Lethal Company doing so well, and of course the Mortuary's Assistant. All games that dare the player to continue. I've spoken in length about my experience of Phasmophobia, different video, go feel free to check it out, link in the description down below. But Lethal Company came out of nowhere, took the core teamwork aspect and proximity chat from Phasmophobia, which itself was influenced by horror games like Friday the 13th and Dead by Daylight and Predator Hunting Grounds, placing the players in an AI driven experience which in both Lethal Company and Phasmophobia have players creating their own stories, play sessions and narratives throughout different stages, risking it all to continue pushing themselves further through this world and reap the rewards. With the impressive AI ghosts of Phasmophobia able to listen to players, able to analyze which players are worth scaring more, learning and watching how players play with each other, giving the ghosts their unpredictable set of rules that make for jump scares that can be sudden, subtle and leaving the player wanting more. Lethal Company runs on a stricter timer than Phasmophobia, giving the players 3 days to collect all the loot they can within these maps, encouraging quick and fast paced action, but because of that moment to moment action it constantly pushes the player to re-enter the building and use all the time they have remaining, while some of the monsters only get worse and worse, with players running face first into spiders or having to work around coil heads, forcing you to look at only it and nothing else. Lethal Company uses the player to create their own jump scares, and they almost are always never not completely hilarious and always so addictive to come back. What? Modern horror audiences thrive with that need to be pushed, going deeper into the unknown and being punished and rewarded by the adrenaline of a good scare by choice of continuance. Even when we saw the fascination of backrooms or Gmod chase maps and even strange NPC horror-like characters on TikToks, this is showing us a whole new generation of jump scares and scares being created to tease, to push and to unsettle players to test the limits of horror. It's interesting that jump scares went from a surprise to the template to the entertainment and now the want. We've adjusted ourselves throughout society with scares. Obviously we all aren't the same. A jump scare from 1970s can be still just as effective to someone now. Many may say it's still a cheap trick being used in horror, and trust me, there are a few bad eggs out there, but I totally disagree with that sentiment altogether. A jump scare has proven it's a whole identity of a generation. It has respectfully grown, innovated itself thanks to the incredible milestones we've touched throughout history. And for a technique that's built on keeping you on your feet, there is oddly something so comforting knowing that this technique is 100 years old and still finds ways to surprise us. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you at the next checkpoints. Goodbye.